This girl unmasks a criminal in disguise, and moments later, everyone is shocked. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The solemn silence of the private chapel in the Harrison mansion was shattered by a scream that cut through the air like a sharp blade. 4-year-old Lily, with her tangled hair and worn dress that contrasted sharply with the elegance of the setting, pointed a small, trembling finger at the man conducting the religious ceremony. "He's not a priest! He's not a priest!" the girl shouted, her voice echoing through the marble-paneled walls of the luxurious residence in Greenwich, Connecticut. "I saw him counting money at Uncle Joe's company." 40 guests from Greenwich high society froze in their places, their gazes alternating between the desperate child and the man in the clerical collar leading the blessing of the new wing of the mansion. Melanie Harrison, 45, felt her heart race violently. Her fingers tightened on the expensive fabric of her navy blue dress as she watched the scene unfold before her eyes. Father Everett, as he had been known for 3 months in town, paled visibly. His hands trembled imperceptibly as he held the prayer book, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the chapel at a comfortable temperature. His brown eyes, normally calm and serene, now darted nervously between the shocked faces of those present. "Child, you must be confused," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've never worked at any company. I've always served God." Lily shook her head vigorously, her dark curls dancing around her thin face. "No, I saw you. You were arguing with the fat man because the numbers were wrong. You yelled that they were stealing." Theodore Harrison, 50, Melanie's husband and host of the ceremony, felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him from head to toe. His guests, influential businessmen, local politicians, and members of the Greenwich elite, murmured among themselves, creating a low, uncomfortable hum that filled the tense silence. "Melanie, do something," Theodore whispered in his wife's ear, his voice loaded with urgency and irritation. "This child is ruining our reputation." Melanie took a step forward, approaching Lily with the intention of diplomatically silencing her. She had invited the girl to the ceremony as part of her recent charitable actions, an attempt to ease the guilt she had carried for years. Lily lived begging in the town square, sleeping under store awnings when the temperature dropped, surviving on the charity of merchants and passers-by. "Lily, honey, you must be," Melanie began, but stopped abruptly when her eyes met the child's. There was something there, a desperate intensity, an absolute certainty that made her hesitate. It wasn't the confused look of a frightened child. It was the look of someone who had seen something real, something that disturbed her deeply. Lily's memory was a phenomenon that impressed everyone who knew her. Despite her tender age and the difficult circumstances of her life, she could remember minute details of people, places, and events with a precision that bordered on the impossible. It was as if her mind photographed every moment lived, storing it with crystal-clear clarity. "I'm not confused," Lily shouted again, tears beginning to form in her large, dark eyes. "He worked at Cornerstone Construction. I saw when Uncle Joe fired him. He cried a lot." The name Cornerstone Construction caused a new buzz among the guests. Everyone in town knew the company, owned by the Caldwell family, historical rivals of the Harrisons in business and local politics. The mention of the rival company in his own house made Theodore clench his fists involuntarily. Father Everett, or whoever he was, took a step back, his composure beginning to disintegrate completely. This child is clearly traumatized. Perhaps it's best if we end the ceremony for today." "No!" Lily ran towards the man, but Melanie intercepted her, crouching down to be at the girl's level. "Aunt Melanie, please believe me, he's not a real priest. I know he isn't." Melanie felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It was protection, maternal instinct, something she had buried deeply after the tragedy that had changed her life forever. Looking into Lily's eyes, she saw reflections of her own pain, of her own desperate search for someone who would believe in her. "I believe you," Melanie whispered, surprising herself. "Tell me what you saw." Theodore approached quickly, placing his hand on his wife's shoulder. "Melanie, we can't listen to the fantasies of a street child. Our guests are waiting. Perhaps our guests can wait a little longer," Melanie replied, her voice loaded with a determination that Theodore hadn't heard in years. "This child has something important to say." Father Everett began to move towards the exit, but Melanie rose suddenly. "Father, aren't you going to stay and clear up this confusion? I'm sure it can be easily resolved." The man stopped, his shoulders tense as stretched ropes. Slowly he turned around, and for a brief moment the mask of clerical serenity slipped completely from his face, revealing the desperation and fear of a cornered man. It was at that instant that Melanie knew, with absolute certainty, that Lily was telling the truth. The child had unmasked an impostor in her own home, in front of the Greenwich elite, and now Melanie needed to decide what to do with this devastating revelation that threatened to shake the foundations of her carefully constructed life. The silence that followed was deafening. Father Everett remained still for long seconds, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests like a hunted animal looking for an escape route. Melanie kept Lily close to her, feeling the girl's small body trembling against her legs. "His real name is Owen Bennett," Lily said suddenly, her clear voice cutting through the tension. "You have a scar on your left arm from when you fell off the ladder in the office, and you always ate bologna sandwiches for lunch." The man in the clerical collar staggered as if he had been punched in the stomach. His legs buckled, and he leaned on the makeshift altar, knocking over a silver candlestick that echoed across the marble floor with a metallic crash that made everyone present jump. How could you know that?" he murmured, his voice now completely stripped of the clerical solemnity he had maintained for months. Theodore approached the man with firm steps, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Who the hell are you? What are you doing in my house?" Owen, for now everyone knew that was his real name, raised his trembling hands. "Please, I can explain. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just needed a place to stay." "Explain!" Theodore practically shouted. "You posed as a man of God, celebrated masses, blessed marriages. How dare you?" Melanie watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Part of her felt the same indignation that consumed her husband, but another part, a part that had remained dormant for years, felt something different as she observed the genuine despair on Owen's face. It was the same expression she saw in the mirror in the months that followed the tragedy that devastated her family. "Lily," Melanie said softly, crouching down again to be at the girl's level. "You said you saw him at Cornerstone Construction. Can you tell me more about what happened there?" The girl nodded vigorously, her eyes shining with the attention she was finally receiving. "He worked with the papers for the buildings. He always stayed late, counting the numbers. One day Uncle Joe got very angry because Owen said the money was missing." "What money?" Melanie pressed gently. "The money from the houses they were building for the town. Owen showed some papers to Uncle Joe and said someone was taking money that wasn't theirs. Then Uncle Joe yelled a lot and fired Owen." A murmur ran through the guests. Everyone knew Joe Caldwell, the patriarch of the rival family and owner of Cornerstone Construction. If there were irregularities in public works projects, it would explain a lot about how the Caldwells had managed to expand their business so quickly in recent years. Owen sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "She's telling the truth," he said in a muffled voice. "I discovered they were overbilling the town for the projects. When I questioned it, I was fired on the spot. Joe Caldwell threatened me, said if I said anything, he'd make sure I never got another job in Greenwich." "And then you decided to pose as a priest?" Theodore asked with disdain. "I had no choice." Owen raised his head, tears streaming down his face. I ran out of money, out of a home. My wife had left me before I lost my job. I was sleeping on the street, eating scraps. When Father Francis stepped aside due to health problems, I saw an opportunity to have a roof over my head and food in my stomach. Melanie felt her heart clench. There was something in Owen's story that resonated with her own experience of loss and despair. And how did you convince everyone you were a priest? I studied a lot, Owen admitted. I spent weeks in the library reading about rituals, prayers, ceremonies. I memorized everything, and people they wanted to believe. No one questioned too deeply. Lily pulled on the hem of Melanie's dress. Aunt Melanie, I saw him crying the day he was fired. He was very sad. I don't think he's a bad person. The child's innocent observation struck Melanie like a lightning bolt. Looking at Owen, she didn't see a calculating criminal, but a broken man who had made desperate decisions. It was the same feeling she had experienced years ago, when the world seemed to have collapsed around her, and she had done things she wasn't proud of to survive emotionally. Theodore, she said softly, maybe we should hear the whole story before deciding what to do. Hear him out? Theodore exploded. This man has deceived us for months, profaned our faith, and you want to hear him out? Yes, Melanie replied with a firmness that surprised everyone, including herself. I want to listen. The guests began to stir restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Some whispered among themselves, others discreetly checked their cell phones, probably calculating how this revelation would affect their own businesses and reputations. Perhaps it's best if we end the meeting for today, suggested Dr. Miller, an influential lawyer in town and a close friend of the Harrison family. This matter requires discretion. No, Melanie said firmly. We're not going to pretend this didn't happen. If there is corruption involving public works projects, it affects the whole town. Owen raised his eyes, surprised by the unexpected defense. Mrs. Harrison, I never wanted to cause problems for anyone. I just wanted to survive. And what exactly do you know about these irregularities? Melanie asked, ignoring the disapproving looks from her husband and the guests. A lot, Owen replied, his voice gaining strength. I have copies of documents, payment records, evidence of systematic overbilling. Joe Caldwell has been embezzling public funds for at least 2 years. Why didn't you take this to the authorities? Asked Dr. Miller. With what credibility? Owen laughed bitterly. A fired accountant against one of the most powerful families in town. Who would believe me? Lily, who had remained quiet listening to the adults' conversation, suddenly pulled on Melanie's dress again. Aunt Melanie, can I stay at your house tonight? It's very cold outside, and I don't want to sleep in the square. The child's simple request created an awkward silence. All those present, rich and influential people, were confronted with the harsh reality that a 4-year-old child was sleeping on the streets while they lived in luxury. Melanie looked at Lily, then at Owen, then at the uncomfortable faces of her guests. A familiar sensation began to grow in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. It was purpose. It was the feeling that, for the first time since the tragedy that had destroyed her family, she had a chance to do something really important. Yes, she said, her voice clear and determined, you can stay with us. Melanie, Theodore whispered urgently, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious, she replied, taking Lily's small hand. And as for Mr. Bennett, I think he also deserves a chance to tell his full story, without pressure, without threats. Owen stared at her with an expression of disbelief mixed with gratitude. Why would you do this for me? Melanie hesitated for a moment, painful memories passing through her mind like ghosts. Because sometimes people do desperate things when they don't see another way out. And sometimes they deserve a second chance. Melanie's decision echoed through the chapel like a bomb, creating shockwaves that she knew would spread far beyond that day, changing not only her life, but the lives of everyone present. 3 weeks had passed since the day the truth exploded in the Harrison Chapel, and the tension in the mansion was almost palpable. Lily had adapted to the routine of the house with an ease that surprised everyone, especially Melanie, who discovered every day how much she had forgotten about caring for a child. The girl now slept in the guest room that Melanie had transformed into a small children's haven, complete with stuffed animals and colourful books. But the nights were difficult. Lily woke up screaming, calling for an Aunt Carol that no one could locate, her little hands scratching the air as if trying to reach someone who wasn't there. She had another nightmare, Theodore said one Thursday morning, his eyes red with fatigue as he came down for breakfast. She screamed for 3 hours straight. The neighbours are going to start complaining. Melanie poured coffee for her husband, noticing how he had avoided her gaze in recent days. The decision to take in Lily had created a crack in their marriage that seemed to deepen with each passing day. She's traumatized, Theodore. She needs time. Time? Theodore slammed his cup on the table harder than necessary. Melanie, this can't go on. People are talking. Yesterday, Mrs. Davison stopped me on the street to ask if we had completely lost our minds. Mrs. Davison can go to hell, Melanie replied coldly, surprising her husband with her language. Since when do we care more about what other people think than about doing what's right? Since our reputation determines the success of our businesses, Theodore exploded. Have you forgotten that we have employees, responsibilities, that your cosmetics company depends on the trust of clients from the local elite? At that moment, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing new pajamas that Melanie had bought for her. Her dark hair was tousled from sleep, and she held a teddy bear against her chest. Is Uncle Theodore mad at me? She asked in her small voice. The innocent question created an awkward silence. Theodore looked at the girl and felt a pang in his chest. Despite all his resistance, it was impossible not to be touched by that little creature who had gone through so much suffering. No, honey, he said, his voice softer. I'm not mad at you. Lily ran to Melanie and clung to her leg. Aunt Melanie, are you going to send me away? Never, Melanie replied immediately, picking the girl up in her arms. You're safe here. But even as she spoke those words, Melanie knew that the situation was becoming unsustainable. Not just because of the social pressure, but because legally she had no rights over Lily. The girl was there completely informally, and at any moment the authorities could appear to take her back into the social welfare system. That same morning, while Lily was playing in the garden under the care of the maid, Melanie decided to visit Owen. The man had managed to get a small apartment on the outskirts of town with the discreet financial help she had offered, and was trying to rebuild his life away from the curious eyes of the Greenwich elite. Owen greeted her in his new home, a simple but clean space, very different from the rectory where he had lived under a false identity. He seemed smaller without the clerical collar, more fragile, but also more human. How have you been feeling? Melanie asked, sitting on the modest sofa that occupied most of the small room. Ashamed, Owen admitted. Every day I wake up remembering the lies I told, the people I deceived. I can't even go near the church without feeling nauseous. And what about the evidence you mentioned? About the corruption at the construction company? Owen got up and walked to a drawer from which he pulled out a thick folder. It's all here. Documents, spreadsheets, records of irregular payments. Joe Caldwell has embezzled at least $2 million in public funds in the last 2 years. Melanie leafed through the documents, her experience as a businesswoman allowing her to quickly grasp the magnitude of the fraud. Why haven't you handed this over to the authorities yet? And give credibility to whom? Owen laughed bitterly. I'm a man who posed as a priest. Who's going to believe me now? I believe you, Melanie said simply, and I have enough influence to make sure this evidence is taken seriously. Owen stared at her in surprise. Why would you do that? Why are you helping me? Melanie hesitated, painful memories surfacing in her mind like reluctant ghosts. Because 5 years ago, when my son died, I also did things I'm not proud of. I lied to doctors, manipulated reports, even bribed hospital staff to try to save his life. It didn't work, of course, but I understand the desperation that leads someone to make extreme decisions. It was the first time Melanie had spoken about her son's death to a stranger. Gabriel was only 7 years old when he was diagnosed with leukemia. For months, she had fought desperately, using all her influence and money to get experimental treatments, consultations with experts abroad, anything that could give hope. In the end, nothing had been enough. "I'm so sorry," Owen said softly. "I didn't know." "Few know the details," Melanie admitted, "but the experience taught me that sometimes people do terrible things for understandable reasons. And sometimes they deserve forgiveness." That afternoon, when Melanie returned to the mansion, she found Theodore in the office on the phone with Dr. Miller. The conversation seemed tense, and her husband gestured nervously as he spoke. "Yes, doctor, I understand your concerns," Theodore was saying, "but I can't just yes, of course, I'll consider your suggestions." When he hung up the phone, Theodore turned to Melanie with a somber expression. "Doctor, Miller thinks we should hand Lily over to the municipal foster care system before this becomes a bigger legal issue." "Absolutely not," Melanie replied categorically. "Melanie, be reasonable. We don't have legal authorization to keep this child. If the authorities find out what? That we're taking care of an abandoned child who was living on the streets? What crime are we committing?" "You know it's not that simple," Theodore sighed. "And there's something else. Dr. Miller heard that Joe Caldwell is furious about the accusations Owen has been spreading around town. He's threatening to sue anyone who repeats these slanders." Melanie felt a wave of anger surge through her body. "Then it's true. If Joe Caldwell is threatening people, it's because he has something to hide. Or because he's being falsely accused by a desperate man who posed as a priest," Theodore retorted. "Melanie, you need to think about the consequences. If we get involved in this mess, we could lose everything." At that moment, Lily appeared in the office doorway, her large eyes fixed on the adults' tense faces. "Are you fighting because of me?" The innocent question created a heavy silence. Melanie crouched down and opened her arms to the girl, who ran into her embrace. "No, honey," Melanie lied softly. "We're just talking about grown-up things." But Lily, with her extraordinary memory and keen perception, had picked up on more than the adults imagined. "Aunt Melanie, if I leave, will you stop fighting?" The question hit Melanie like a punch in the stomach. The girl was willing to sacrifice herself to maintain peace in the family that had taken her in. It was a devastating maturity for a 4-year-old, the result of months living on the streets and learning to read the emotions of adults to survive. "You're not leaving," Melanie said firmly, squeezing Lily against her chest. "Never." But even as she spoke those words, Melanie knew that forces beyond her control were moving to test that promise in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 5 months had passed since that fateful morning in the chapel, and the autumn in Greenwich painted the trees of the Harrison mansion with golden hues that reflected the silent transformation that had taken hold of their lives. Melanie was in the garden watching Lily play when she received the call that would change everything. "Mrs. Harrison?" The voice on the other end of the line was female, tremulous, loaded with an emotion that Melanie couldn't immediately identify. "My name is Carol Santos. I'm Lily's aunt." Melanie's blood ran cold. For months she had tried to locate the girl's relatives without success. And now, when she had finally begun to feel like a real mother again, Lily's past resurfaced like a ghost. "Where have you been all these months?" Melanie asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she watched Lily build castles in the sandbox they had installed in the garden. I was sick," Carol replied, her voice breaking. "Very sick. When my sister Joanne died, I tried to take care of Lily, but I couldn't. I wasn't right in the head. One day I just went out to buy food and couldn't make it back home. I ended up admitted to a clinic in Hartford." Melanie felt her heart clench. "And now?" Now I'm better. The doctors say I can take care of her. I've come to get my niece." The call ended with Carol promising to arrive in Greenwich the next day, and Melanie stood in the garden for long minutes, watching Lily play happily, unaware that her life was about to change again. That night, Melanie couldn't sleep. She walked through the empty house. Theodore had traveled to New York on business, and ended up stopping in Lily's room. The girl slept peacefully, hugging the teddy bear that had become her inseparable companion. In recent months, the nightmares had decreased significantly, replaced by peaceful nights and dreams that made her wake up smiling. "How am I going to tell her?" Melanie whispered into the void. The answer came the next morning when Carol Santos knocked on the door of the mansion. She was a 38-year-old woman, too thin, with sunken eyes that revealed months of suffering, but there was an iron determination in her gaze that Melanie recognized immediately. It was the same determination she herself had developed when fighting for her son's life. "I want to see Lily," Carol said without preamble. Melanie led her to the living room, where Lily was drawing in a new notebook. When the girl looked up and saw Carol, her face lit up with a pure joy that broke Melanie's heart. "Aunt Carol!" Lily shouted, dropping her crayons and running into the woman's arms. "You're back! I knew you'd come back!" Carol hugged her niece with a desperate intensity, tears streaming down her thin face. "Forgive me, my little one. Forgive me for abandoning you. Forgive me for everything." Melanie watched the reunion with a mixture of joy and pain. It was beautiful to see Lily in the arms of her real family, but at the same time, she felt as if she was losing a daughter again. "Aunt Carol, look!" Lily said excitedly, picking up the drawing notebook. "I learned to draw houses, and this is Aunt Melanie's house, where I live now." Carol looked at her niece's drawings, then at Melanie, and something in her face softened. "She seems happy here." "She is happy here," Melanie replied softly. "But I understand you want to take her." "Actually," Carol said hesitantly, "I'd like to talk to you about that. About her future." That afternoon, while Lily played in the garden, the two women talked at length. Carol told about her hospitalization, about the months of treatment for severe depression, about how the guilt for having abandoned Lily had almost destroyed her completely. "I got a job as a nurse's aide in Hartford," Carol explained. "It's an honest job, but the salary is small. It barely pays for a small room on the outskirts. Lily deserves more than that." "Lily deserves a family that loves her," Melanie replied. "And you love her. That's more important than money." "But is it enough?" Carol asked, her eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Harrison, you've given my niece things I'll never be able to give. Education, security, opportunities. Is love enough to compensate for everything I can't offer?" It was a question that had no easy answer, and Melanie knew it. During the weeks that followed, an unusual solution began to take shape. Carol rented a small house on the outskirts of Greenwich with Melanie's discreet financial help, and Lily began to divide her time between the two houses, spending the days at the mansion where she attended a private school and received music and painting lessons, and the nights with Carol, where she experienced the unconditional love of her real family. It was during this period of adaptation that Owen reappeared in their lives unexpectedly. He had gotten a job at Melanie's cosmetics company, initially as a temporary accountant, but his dedication and knowledge soon made him indispensable. More importantly, he had finally found the courage to hand over the evidence of corruption to the relevant authorities. The investigation that followed shook Greenwich. Joe Caldwell was arrested, and his construction company had all public contracts cancelled. The money recovered was used to reform the city's social welfare system, including the municipal foster care, which now offered decent conditions for the children who needed care. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. During the investigation of the construction company's documents, it was discovered that Joanne Santos, Lily's mother, had not only been a common employee. She was a trained civil engineer who had been fired when she discovered the irregularities in the projects. the same irregularities that Owen would find years later. "Your mother was a hero," Melanie said to Lily one Sunday afternoon, while the three of them, she, Carol, and the girl, were gathered in the mansion's garden. "She tried to do the right thing, even knowing it would cost her her job." Lily, now 5 years old and visibly more mature after months of stability, absorbed the information with the seriousness of a miniature adult. "So Mommy was brave like Aunt Melanie and Aunt Carol?" "Very brave," Carol replied, stroking her niece's hair. "And you're brave too, little one. It was your courage that uncovered the truth about that fake man." Owen's story had also found its redemption. With the construction company's scandal resolved and his reputation partially restored by the crucial role he played in the investigation, he managed to rebuild his life. He never posed as a priest again, but he found peace working honestly and helping Melanie manage social programs funded by her company. Theodore, initially resistant to all these changes, gradually adapted to the new family dynamic. Lily's presence had brought a lightness to the mansion that he hadn't realized how much he missed, and seeing his wife reborn emotionally after years of silent grief made him realize that some things were more important than society's opinion. A year after that fateful day in the chapel, Melanie was again in her garden, but this time she was not alone. Lily played with other children from the neighborhood who had been invited to her 6th birthday party. Carol helped in the kitchen, preparing traditional sweets she had learned from her mother. Theodore chatted animatedly with Owen about the company's new social projects. And at the center of it all, a little girl who had started by begging in the town square now laughed freely, surrounded by 2 families who had learned that true love knows no legal limits or social conventions. "Aunt Melanie," Lily said, running to her with a drawing in her hands, "I made this for you." It was a drawing of 2 houses, one large and one small, connected by a colorful bridge. In the sky, a female figure with wings watched everything with a smile. "Who's that in the sky?" Melanie asked. "It's Mommy," Lily replied simply. "She's happy because now I have 2 families who love me." Melanie hugged the girl, feeling tears of gratitude stream down her face. She had lost a son, but gained a daughter. She had discovered that redemption sometimes comes in unexpected forms, and that life's greatest blessings often arrive disguised as problems that we need to have the courage to face. That night, when all the visitors had left and Lily slept peacefully in her bed, sometimes in the mansion, sometimes in Carol's house, according to her choice each day, Melanie looked at the starry sky of Greenwich and said a silent prayer of gratitude. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful stories begin with the most difficult moments. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.